In this video, I'm going to give you the complete system for profitable growth with an appointment setting team. And it's the same system that I give my clients to help them ramp setters that hold KPI, halve their cost per book call, and scale predictably. Because everything wrong with a setting team comes downstream of two domains: the data that you're misreading and the skill that your setters were never actually taught. But if you fix them in the right order, the talent problem will mostly dissolve on its own. So first, let's start with where your setting team is actually failing. Before any system I give you is going to actually make sense, you need to see the situation for what it actually is, because once you see it clearly, everything after it is easy to apply. So we'll go slow through this first part, because almost the entire reason that managers struggle and fail to ramp setters, can't hold them in KPI, and can't scale without your margin shrinking is sitting inside of it. So I'll give you the uncomfortable starting point, is that categorically very few managers running high ticket setting teams right now actually know how to manage one to the tune that it's actually capable of. Because most setter managers just got handed a team, or they were genuinely good closers and haven't built deep expertise in setter management. And being a good closer teaches you almost nothing about business operations, financial modeling, creating decision sequences from reading data, and understanding lead awareness levels, or the actual science of scaling predictably. So what the team ends up with is a caretaker who herds people around all day, and the setting layer becomes the single most neglected part of the whole revenue operation. And the scary part is that many managers really have no idea, because if they did have a clue about what I'm going to walk through, there's really no way in their right mind that they'd keep letting it happening, because it's really a lose-lose in most of these decisions that a lot of setter managers are making, a lot of founders leading setting teams are making. So it's an indication that there's a level of unconscious incompetence, but it's really the default state of setter management across the industry. So you're almost certainly one of two people reading this. The first is the founder who's become the bottleneck. So you can set, you might even be excellent at it, but you've never managed to ramp anyone else up to your level. So every setter you bring on underperforms, never gets into KPI, and eventually you have to cut them, which drops you straight back onto the phones to keep the revenue alive. And so you can't scale because you've got no time, and you've got no time because you're either spending it doing a mid-level job yourself, or as we discussed, you're doing an excellent job yourself, but nobody can take it off your hands. So the business is effectively capped at the ceiling of your own calendar. And the second is the manager or founder running a team that's trying to push past 1, 2, or 3 million a month, and they can't do it cleanly. The revenue shows up in waves, or it's lumpy, but every single time you go to scale, it gets chaotic, or the margin just thins out. So scaling feels like a gamble instead of a process. The setting system underneath it was never actually built or managed on first principles, so the whole thing wobbles the second you put any weight on it. So small or large, solo or team, it's the same person with the same root cause. The setting function isn't managed properly at the foundation, so it either traps you as the only competent operator in the building, or it caps how profitably that your team can actually grow. So if any of this has been your last few months, this is the symptom set. You can't ramp setters into KPI. So what happens is you hire, you train them a bit, you wait, and then they sit under target or KPI for months with no real read on whether they're actually getting better or whether you're just burning money. And then you cut them, usually way too late, and you start the whole cycle all over again. And you're stuck firing and rehiring on a loop. So the story you tell yourself is that setters churn because they all want to become closers, or that the leads are bad, or that good people just don't last in the role. So you keep cycling bodies through seats and you never compound an actual team. And your dollar per lead is sitting low and you don't know what it's costing you. So your setters are only ever getting a chance to call fresh leads once or twice. So most of your leads barely get worked. Around 91% of your pickups though will come inside the first 4 dials, and you're nowhere near that level of penetration, which means that your cost per call is way higher than it needs to be, because you're buying leads that you never ever actually get to contact properly. And every time you scale, your ROAS drops. So you add more lead spend on top of a setting team that already can't keep up. So the chaos just keeps compounding at the trench level. Your cost per book call climbs, and then the margin shrinks. So scaling makes the business busier and barely more profitable, and eventually you just learn to pull back. And your best setter quietly carries the whole team, and you can't replicate them. So one person hits the numbers or the KPIs, and you have no real idea of what he's actually doing differently, so you can't teach it, you can't hire for it, and you live in quiet fear of him leaving, or effectively that salesperson has you at gunpoint with a lot of your decisions. And none of this means that you're lazy or bad at business. It's just the predictable result of running a setting team on instinct and inherited habits instead of running it on a system, which is exactly what almost everyone at your stage is doing. The managers who scale the fastest aren't working harder than you. They've just stopped adding, i.e. adding more setters, more leads, or longer or more scripts, or any additive measures on top of additive measures, and they effectively start removing the constraint underneath that was making all of it unreliable in the very first place. Now, these are not talent questions, they are system questions. So you can't ramp setters because you've got no ramping protocol and no read on their trainability. You can't hold KPI because you don't quality control the data or the skill. And you can't scale profitably because you're sequencing your decisions in the wrong order, and what it's doing is leaking margin at the setter layer every single month you try to grow. But if you fix the system, the talent problem will mostly dissolve on its own because the same people start producing the moment the structure around them is actually correct. Now, everything in this document comes downstream of two domains that almost every setter manager actually fails at, plus one discipline that sits across both and decides whether you ever build a real team at all. That's what the rest of this breaks down in the order that you actually need to fix it. These are the two domains that most managers fail at. Everything that's inefficient with your setting team comes downstream of two domains. Once you can see them as separate things, you can actually diagnose which one is breaking the business instead of guessing. So these are the two. The first is operations, data, and financial modeling. This is whether you can actually read the story your data is telling you, i.e. your dial per lead, your contact rate, your true hours worked, knowing how to throttle and quality control lead flow, and then sequencing your scaling decisions in the right order, knowing your unit economics, and building a compensation plan that actually pencils. So this is a layer that decides whether you're running a business or really just supervising one. Domain 2 is the skill of setting itself. So specifically the skill of raising a prospect's awareness and meeting them where they are. And on cold paid traffic, this is a 20 to 30% swing in conversion, or an extra 3 to 4x ROAS either way, depending on whether your setters can actually address a prospect based on where they are, or whether they just force every lead into a box that your script has for them, or for example, hear a bad answer and just move on regardless, right? That's the whole game. Operations on one side and skill on the other. The typical setter manager came up as a closer, so they instinctively lean on the skill side, except they can't actually teach awareness raising because most of them haven't done it themselves, or their experience is largely centered around dealing with warm enough traffic. And then they ignore the operations side completely because nobody ever taught them that the data is where the money is hiding. And then the rarer failure is a spreadsheet manager who tracks everything but can't coach human beings through a single sales call. The managers who scale run both deliberately. And then there's a third thing that isn't really a domain on its own, but it sits across both, and that's ramping and performance management and effectively knowing when to cut or keep setters. It belongs across the top because you can't do it without both of the domains underneath it. So you need the data to know objectively when someone isn't trending towards KPI, and you need the skill knowledge to know what's actually deficient and whether it's even trainable. If you get this part wrong, it really doesn't matter how good the rest of your system is, because you either marry yourself to setters who are never going to make it, or you'll cut people who should have been ramped. Most managers do both to different people in the same month. So we're going to fix these in a deliberate order. First, we start with operations and data because it's the fastest money in the building. It's the lowest hanging fruit and it's the easiest thing to move. And it will usually halve your cost per book call on its own before you've touched anyone's actual setting skill. The second is then from there we go into the skill itself, because it's the deeper, slower lever that compounds once the foundation is clean. And then from there, we can put it all together with ramping and performance management once you've got the data to read people and the skill framework to train them. And remember, money is the ultimate metric in all of it. Every decision in this document is downstream of one question. Does it make the setting team more money than it costs? Domain 1 is the data that you're not reading or you're reading wrong. So this is the fastest money in your business because it's mostly already sitting there waiting for you and you just can't see it. So here's the thing that few setter managers understand. Your data is telling you a story, and the managers who fail are failing because they either never look at it, or they try to make the data match their preconceived stories, or they look at the data and read the story completely wrong. So the first job is to build an intimate relationship with your numbers where you know exactly where every figure comes from, who filled in that data, what is the source of truth, and what it actually means. Because the moment you outsource that to a dashboard that you really don't understand, you start making confident decisions off numbers that are lying to you. So what I'll do is I'll show you the ones that matter and the ways you're probably having the data lie to you right now. The first is the dial per lead, which is the master number. The dial per lead tells you whether you have enough outbound work going into your outbound leads. So that's the whole story behind it. Are your setters dialing enough relative to the volume of leads coming in to actually get all they can out of those leads? And almost every tracker I've actually ever opened that I haven't built really calculates it wrong. Or if it's being calculated right, the setter manager plays effectively lip service to it and doesn't use it. But typically speaking, it's either not being tracked or being tracked wrong. So one incredibly common mistake is that people pull dial per lead off their total leads, but you can't dial a lead that's already self-booked. So if you already have a direct booking funnel or that sort of aspect, you can't dial a lead that came in as an inbound triage. So those numbers were never outbound callable in the first place. So the second that you put them in the denominator, the numbers stop meaning anything because you're measuring dials against a pile of leads that half of were never actually yours to dial. All right. So for example, I've come into accounts at 100K a month and their dial per lead was reading 0.9. So when I changed the formula to pull from outbound callable leads only, the real number showed up. Right? And I came into another one recently with the exact same error baked into their sheet. It was the same fix. This was only last week from the filming of this video. So before you trust your dial per lead at all, what you want to do is strip out anything that's self-booked. If you have that, strip out inbound triages and anything that came in already converted, and then divide your dials by what's left, which is your genuinely outbound callable leads, right? So in the case of example, in this case, either way, 0.9 and 1.3 is way too low. Right? But at least once you actually track it properly, you can see even tracked properly at 1.3 is way too low, and we need to start acting on that. So knowing the difference between pickup rate, contact rate, and unique dial rate. So three numbers get used interchangeably by people who really don't understand them, and they measure these completely different. The first is the pickup rate, which is the pickups divided by the dials, or how often a dial gets answered. It's useful, but it's not the end state. Right? Then you have the contact rate, which is the pickups divided by the leads, i.e. how many of your actual leads you get a human being on the phone with. This is the one that matters most because it already factors in your pickup rate and however many dials it took to get there. It's a truth of how many of your leads you actually speak to. Then from there, the one that's typically never tracked is the unique dial rate, which is the percentage of your dials that are going to the first time or never before called leads. So if, for example, 80% of the time your setters are dialing new leads, this immediately tells me you have a low dial per lead, and effectively you're not able to penetrate your leads if they don't pick up the first time, which even with a 50% pickup rate, you wouldn't get them the first time at scale, right? It's 50-50. All right, so the last one is a sleeper. If your unique dial rate is up around 80%, it means 80% of your dials are brand new leads, which means you're only ever getting one crack at a lead before you move on and never come back to it. The best practice really sits around 40%. A high unique dial rate is a flashing light that says you've got too many leads, or your setters are only ever chasing fresh ones, and either way, you're leaving most of your pickups on the table. The only other instance is that effectively you don't have that many leads, but your setters are only calling new leads, and then the leads that didn't pick up the first time, they're just not calling them. But typically it's a case of Hanlon's razor, do not attribute to malice, which can be attributed to stupidity, or just ineffective systems in this case, which is the setters are not avoiding old leads, they just can't get in contact with them because they're prioritizing the hot leads that are coming into the business at such a rate that they can't call the old leads enough to penetrate the 91% likelihood that they'll pick up in the first 4 dials, right? So the contact rate is a number to fall in love with. You want it upwards of 60%, ideally 70%, and there are only 3 levers that move it. First is your speed to lead. Then, as we discussed, your dial per lead, and then from there, having healthy phone numbers. That's really it. You can stare at your contact rate all day, but those 3 things are the only way that you'll ever change it. Let's discuss the fake pickup rate, or where your tracker is probably lying to you, right? So I've come into accounts where the pickup rate was reading 29% on a dial per lead of 9, right? And I knew more or less immediately that the 29% wasn't real or as we know it, right? So what you're saying is you're calling people on the 9th or 10th dial, and you're telling me that 30% of them pick up. In most industries, 30% pickup rate is pretty damn good. And if we know that 91% of your pickups come in the first 4 dials, what's a real likelihood that, you have a true 30%. If the signal's already going off to you, you can understand that effectively it may be a 30% pickup rate, but it's because all you're ever doing is calling new leads. So you're going to have an unnecessarily high cost per book call and a vanity metric and a high pickup rate, right? Which is why you want to optimize for a high contact rate, not just a high pickup rate. And you do that by throttling your dial per lead and your unique dial rate. This is starting to come together, right? At scale in a B2C info market, that really doesn't happen. After about 4 to 4.5 dials, your pickup rate will fall off a cliff. So a high pickup rate sitting on top of a very high dial per lead is a tell that the number is fake, or that you've got an unusually very good lead, right? Like a real service offer where you can call someone to the 7th dial and you still get them. Cross-checking the numbers against each other is how you catch this. But really, why was it fake? It's because the pickup was being counted off a time trigger a lot of the time instead of a disposition, which is something that I'm seeing more and more of as people are outsourcing their data to APIs, especially from, without naming any names of CRMs, CRMs that are tracking your pickup rate for you, right? The setter's Apple call screening was firing a connection that lasted long enough to trip this was a pickup filter, even though no human ever answered. So the tracker counted a screened, never answered call as a pickup. Right? So what will happen is either 1 second connections or the Apple call screening is having the CRM trigger that it was a pickup, right? The principle underneath this is the one that will save you over and over. And that's, you want to base your pickups on the end state disposition the human setter actually sets, not on a time trigger and not on an API's guess, right? So by the setter actually deciding what it was, that should be what your pickups are based on, is the amount of dispositions, not an API triggering it, or outsourcing it to a Looker studio where you've never really had any involvement to understand where the source of truth is, right? Because if your data is lying to you, you can't effectively make accurate decisions, right? Right? So the setter heard the screening, the setter knows it wasn't a real answer, the setter will mark it as no answer. That human discretion is more accurate than any automation because the automation has no logic. It just blindly says long enough, must have been a pickup, right? This is exactly why the people selling you automated dashboards, Looker Studio setups get you in trouble. They strip out the tacit tribal knowledge of the humans on your team and then hand the data to an API that can't think, right? And the type of person who buys those setups usually doesn't like looking at data anyway, so they never sanity check it. They just trust it because, oh, it came from the CRM, right? Whereas some things are supposed to stay analog, at least until we've got AGI that can sit in the chair and read a call the way your setter can or you can. Because in other instances, if there's reschedules, cancellations, if this isn't mapped into, if there's anything that's missing, you're better off just having a VA do it at $4 an hour. It doesn't suck up your time. You should just be quality controlling what the VA is doing and having trained the VA from you doing it, filming Looms, showing them how to pull the data. It's incredibly simple. I still don't see how a Looker studio with the risk that it has to misreport is worth the ROI, because it doesn't make you effectively more money. Visibility itself is inherently useless unless you're able to make decisions from it. So even if it is tracking accurately, you can do it for marginally the same cost, knowing for sure it's never going to break or fail with a VA, right? This is why a lot of the dashboard game is a category error in terms of it being a software that's actually got product market fit. But not to get into that today. Now we're going to go through the true hours trap, or the one of three things test. So here's how you put it all together and reveal the truth out of a setter without ever needing to stand over their shoulder. So when the dials per hour comes out too low for the pickup rate, the setter is doing one of exactly three things. And what you want to do is, in conversation, you walk them down each one. One, they're falsifying their dials, which is rare. Most won't actually fake the dial count because it's too obvious and they know you can track it. The second is that they're over-reporting their hours. This is the common one because they think padding their hours, if you get them to write it down, makes them look like they're working harder when it actually does the opposite. If a setter reports 8 hours and only really productively worked 4, their dials per hour will crater and they'll look lazy. If they just reported the 4 hours that they were actually in the chair, the number would have looked completely healthy, and I've been able to leave them alone and just effectively tell them you need to work more hours, right? And then the third is they're spending too long on each call. So generally on the phone for too long, having 30-minute setter conversations that really should have been 7 to 12. And this is why it's important to have a baseline setter system where you know that it's not worth the call going to 30 minutes, even if they do book, even if it creates a hot, cracked lay down for the closers, right? You do not want, especially your closers, telling your junior setters you need to cook them more because they only want to deal with laydowns and not do their job. When in reality, you could have a 35-minute setting call that makes an absolute piff laydown, let's say. They're just cracked. But if you could have made 3 sets in that time and you have like a 50% show rate or 60% show rate, that great cracked person half the time doesn't even show up when you could have had 3 bookings, which will still like close at scale. You see what I mean? Is effectively, it's not as simple as how good is the lead coming onto the calendar. Ideally, we have fantastically warm leads, but we should be able to do that in a baseline. If your account has a 30-minute setting call, and that's truly what needs to be done, and I would argue most of the time it doesn't. In 90% of cases, it could be 15 minutes, just based on the other assets you have in your funnel. It should be around 7 to 12 minutes, depending on the industry, up to 15, instead of having a 3-minute conversation that might not show up anyway, right? So what you'll do is you'll follow them down the lie until there's nowhere left to stand. So what you want to ask is you say, okay, if you genuinely work the full 8 hours, then your dials per hour is terrible and you need to fix it. Or you only actually worked 4 and the rest you were doing something else. So you just need to pick one, right? Either answer hands you the coaching point. You don't need to be a magician. You just triangulate dials, pickup rate, conversation length, and hours, and you let the numbers check each other. So that's the whole skill of reading the operations layer. The data is your call center floor in a remote setting team. You want to build an intimate relationship with it, know where every number comes from, and never let an automation make a decision that a human should be making. And in the next section, I'll give you the single target that fixes most of what we just diagnosed and the exact math to hit it. So this is the 3.5 to 4.5 dial per lead pocket and why more is typically a waste, right? So now that you can read the data, here's the single target that fixes most of what we just diagnosed. If you do nothing else in this entire document, sit your team in the dial per lead pocket and you'll already have made yourself more money than most managers making a quarter of fiddling around with the skill. All right. So this is why 91% of your money is in the first 4 dials. Around 91% of your pickups come in the first 3.5 to 4.5 dials. It's just not a number that I made up. It's what shows up across accounts after account once you look at the pickup rate by lead age. So day 1 pickup rate is strong. Day 2 holds. Day 3 starts to soften. And by the 4th or 5th dial, it falls off a cliff for most markets. So the entire game of dial per lead is penetration. You want to dial each lead enough times to actually capture the pickups that are sitting in those first 4 dials and really not much further. Because past that point, you're spending your setters time on leads that have already told you with their silence, i.e. they're not picking up, that they're not going to pick up. So if you're only sitting on a 1.6 dial per lead, like most teams, if you do this math, here's what that actually means in plain terms. Your setters are getting 1, maybe 2 cracks at a lead before they move on forever. And you're leaving the majority of your available pickups uncalled, which means you're buying leads you never contact, which means your cost per call is inflated for no reason other than that nobody called the lead a 3rd or 4th time, right? And I've got clients that are out of the 5th dial and they're still getting their pickups then at scale, not just red herrings, right? So this is critical to cut your cost per call. Okay? Now this is the pocket and why more isn't better. So the target is a 3.5 to 4.5 dial per lead, right? Below it, you're under penetrating and bleeding the contact rate. Above it, you've hit the point of diminishing returns because if you've already at that 4 dial per lead, calling those same leads maybe a 5th, 6th or 7th time is not going to give you an order of magnitude return or such that it's actually worth it, as opposed to them actually, the setters being reallocated to new leads, right? You get the odd red herring, the lead who picks up on the 6th, maybe 9th dial, and oftentimes what founders will do or managers will do is to hold up that example and see, look, this guy, we called him on the 9th dial and he piffed, so we all need to do it. If you actually look at scale at the time that was wasted to get to that sale, it literally financially wasn't worth it, right? But he also called 600 people who never answered and it wasn't worth the time. That's just your cost per call quietly climbing, right? So once you're sitting in the pocket on your main lead source, the move is to farm the rest of your pipeline with the spare capacity. So old leads past the dial threshold, sure, you can hit it a little bit past it, but setters should be reallocating the effort to no-shows, cancellations and reschedules, people who didn't book, other funnels if you have them, low ticket upsells. You want to look at other ways beyond just calling leads out to their, I've seen in some cases, they have a dial per lead of like 21, right? And this is just like, they've just never had a pickup there for like 4 months or ever. Had anyone pick up past the 10th dial? No, not even one, but they're still doing it, right? Where every hour of labor for a setter is better reallocated to something where they can actually generate revenue, right? So you farm all of that, but you protect the efficiency of your main source. The exception is lead quality. If you've got a real service offer rather than like sort of a typical transactional or hype heavy info product, you can often call a lead to the 7th dial, book them a week out, and still have them show up at like 70, 85% because the offer holds its value over time. Whereas a hot info offer, typically the opposite. The interest is hot air, and it's typically a trend. If they don't pick up in the first few dials, they're gone. So you have to police the speed to lead like a ruthless cop or you lose them. That's where most of the pickup will come in a lot of these transactional sub 10K or sub 5K info products. Speed to lead is critically just as important as dial per lead. And in those cases, typically dial per lead is sitting somewhere between 2.5 to 3.5, where you'll see most of your pickups. But you can just simply track this by tracking the pickup by lead age, right? And having your dial per lead, not 1.6. I'm going to go through an entire protocol of how to have the dial per lead dialed in. If you're not in charge of the marketing team, how to actually communicate with the marketing team. If you are, how to communicate with the marketing team nonetheless, or if you're in control of the lead flow, to throttle this such that it maximizes the pickup rate and creates the most efficient cost per book call, right? So what we'll walk through is the weekend problem and the weekday math. So here's the part that trips managers up, and it's pure arithmetic. Leads are an organic entity. They come in 7 days a week, right? And then they age. But most teams, a lot of setting teams don't dial on the weekend, or one setter or a few setters will do it and they'll cover and they'll just get through the list once on the weekend, so they maybe work a half day, right? So your weekend dial per lead is basically 0. And if you aim for a 3.5 dial per lead Monday to Friday, those 2 dead weekend days are going to drag your weekly average down into the low 2s. Like you might have a 2.1 or that 1.9, 1.6 dial per lead that you typically see because you have no labor on the weekend and very little in the weekdays. So you overcompensate inside the working week. I'll show you the math because it's exactly what I do live in the sheet. So let's say you're getting 65 leads a day on average. You want to land in the pocket across the whole week, so you aim for a 4.5 dial per lead Monday to Friday to leave room for the dead weekend. So let's do math. 65 leads times 4.5, so you do the daily lead times the dial per lead equals 293 dials per day. That's Monday to Friday. 293 dials times 5 working days is 1,465 dials in the week. The weekend adds nothing, so if you spread that across all 7 days, the 1,465 divided by 7, importantly, you have roughly 209 dials a day averaged over the week. Again, 65 leads a day, that nets you a real dial per lead in the low to mid 3s across the full week, even though 2 of the days were 0. So what we've done here is effectively just increase the dials without increasing the leads in Monday to Friday. So if our KPI dial per lead is 3.5, we aim for a 4.5 to 5 dial per lead Monday to Friday, knowing that no one works on the weekend, so that overall we get a 3.5 dial per lead, right? So that's the whole setup. You aim for 4.5 in the week, so when the weekend drags it down, you still land in a healthy pocket, all right? And now go hit a 4.5 dial per lead, stops being a vague instruction your setters don't know what to do with, because you've converted it into a concrete daily dial number that they can actually chase. So you simply use this equation and you'll know, not just reasoning by analogy, either, oh yeah, we hit 100 dials because it's like a famous number you're supposed to dial, 100, 150 dials, or worse, you don't police them at all, which is something we'll get into as well, specifically to look past the stories, right? But when you do it from math, you see that they need to do 200 dials a day to effectively still achieve a 3.5 dial per lead over the whole week. This will maximize the pickup rate for them. And as we'll walk through as well in this video, if you have any limiting beliefs around, damn, my setters don't want to work this much, if they were making more money, they would. And the way they make more money is by getting more bookings. And they get more bookings if more people pick up. And they have more people pick up if their pickup rate is higher. And their pickup rate is higher if the dial per lead is optimized, right? So it's a system that creates the dopamine loop to get your setters to actually go above and beyond and work more than you think. So here we'll walk through the rule of 100 and 50 contacts. So the clean way to hand this to a team is the rule of 100. When a setter isn't on an inbound triage, if they also do inbound booked calls where the prospect books directly, either you do a triage call to decide whether they're going to go on a sales call, or it's an intercepting call where they've already booked a call, right? Either way, if setters have this in their workday where they need to allocate time to calling inbound triages, this is what is going to be relevant for you. So when they're not on inbound triage, they're on outbound, and the mandate is roughly $100 to $110 a day and 50 unique contacts a day. So this way they can triple dial one lead and it still only counts as one contact, which is exactly what you want, because it forces them to actually penetrate leads to the pocket instead of skimming the top of a fresh list once. This will also mitigate, right, through the economics of how you set up the business and the sales team. It'll stop these essentially fake work behaviors that setters do in the industry, where they fake dial, they'll dial then hang up because it shows up on your CRM like close as that they made a dial, because it only starts counting on the connection point. So it looks like 0 seconds. It looks like they sat through the whole voicemail when they didn't. They're just doing it because you made them do more dials. Whereas if you get them to penetrate contacts, right, it doesn't matter about just the dials. They need to have 50 unique contacts. They're going to actually bother to try to contact the person, right? And then you also hold them, as we'll discuss, to having a amount of units or bookings per week. So this is critical as well, right? The target does two things at once. It raises your dial per lead towards 4, and it surfaces a true pickup rate, because right now a lot of teams have a fake looking pickup rate sitting on the top of the fact that they only ever dial fresh leads once. So like I said before, the instance of that client where we came into the business, we could see that they had a 30% pickup rate, but a 9 dial per lead. Well, what we found was the dial per lead was wrong, right? And effectively the setters were never getting a chance to call people twice, right? So start calling old leads a third and fourth time, and your contact rate will climb because those people finally pick up. So don't lower your leads, raise your dial. So this is the principle I come back to every single time, and it's the one that most managers get backwards, right? Which is, when dial per lead is low, the lazy fix is to turn the lead volume down so the ratio looks better. Don't do that, right? You don't want to go backwards on revenue to a flatter number. Turn the dial volume up to match the surplus of leads instead, right? And this may also mean if your setters are already working at capacity, that will tell you from data, as an example of data telling you what to do to make a setter higher, right? Now here's why this is the easiest win you'll ever get. Getting a team to stop being lazy and actually dial is one of the lowest effort, highest return moves in the entire business. I've used it as a first decision upon working with a new client more than once. So if you're a consultant, it's one of the easiest ways to fix a revenue leak and get the client results within like 1 week. You walk into the account, you look at the setter data, you see they're sitting at 1.6 dial per lead, doing 2.5 hours of real work a day. You get them to actually dial, and the cost per book call will halve. That money was just sitting there the whole time because nobody made the leads get actually worked. The irony of effort is real here too, right? When I've taken teams from $150 to $260, the pickup rate often went up, not down, even though more dialing should mean more time on the phone and on conversation, and therefore fewer dials. But why is it with an increased pickup rate, the setters still did more dials, right? When before, it was enough of a stretch to get them to work the full workday efficiently. It's because more dials means more conversations. More conversations means more bookings. More bookings means more dopamine. And then the setters will stay on the dialer and work harder because it feels like a casino paying out, right? One of the most morale-breaking things for a setting team is that people just don't pick up. And it's the same for a sales team when people don't show up. Despite what a lot of setters, closers like to say on Instagram, someone doesn't show up and they go back to bed and it's like, yay. It's massively debilitating, especially for anyone that remotely wants to be successful. So that's why a closer needs to get straight into revenue generating activities unless they make a deliberate decision to take a rest because they've otherwise done revenue generating activities. Or a setter is typically going to work a lot harder when their pickup rate is higher. So this is why you must critically address your pickup rate or your contact rate as well. All right? Because effort compounds into more effort once the bookings start landing. So the sequence is simple. Read the data correctly, sit the team in the 3.5 to 4.5 pocket using the weekday math, hold them to the rule of 100, and raise dials instead of lowering leads. If you do only that, you've already fixed the single most expensive leak in most setting teams. But raising dials assumes you're adding that work in the right order. If you get the sequence wrong, adding more can actively make you less money, which is exactly what the next section is about. This is the scaling sequence that most teams get backwards. This is where good intentions go to die. A manager wants to grow, so they add more leads, more setters, more spend. And because they add in the wrong order, the additions don't compound, they collide, right? Additive measures on top of additive measures, all of it downstream of a foundation that they couldn't take the weight in the first place. Scaling a setting team is a sequence, not a pile. The order you do things in is the entire difference between growth that compounds and growth that quietly costs you money. So I'll show you the 2 ways that teams add, why it blows up, and then the order that actually will work, right? So these are the 2 ways that teams add and why both blow up. There are really only 2 levers people pull when scaling a setting team, and almost everyone pulls them wrong. They add leads onto an already bad dial per lead. So if your setters are sitting at a 1.6 dial per lead and can't work the leads they've already got, pouring more leads on top doesn't give you more bookings, it gives you more chaos at the trench level. The setter can't call the new volume at the rate it's coming in, so their leads just get barely touched, and your unique dial rate will climb towards 80%, like I said, and you just made your penetration problem bigger and paid for the privilege, right? Or they add setters with no lead reallocation. So this is the one that quietly will destroy teams and the top 30 of your team. A manager will bring on new bodies, but doesn't think about where the leads come from. So the new setters get fed off the same pile, which means your existing high producing setters suddenly have their lead flow robbed out from underneath them. Their dial per lead craters, they starts to get diluted, their income drops, and then your best person, the one usually making you most of your revenue, gets punished for a decision that it had nothing to do with, right? So both come from the same blindness, treating scaling as just add more stuff. Let's just scale instead of sequencing the right things in the right order. Now we'll walk through the quadruple threat. So let me give you a real client example, which I've anonymized because it shows you how fast this compounds when you stack the mistakes. A team that I knew had a setter who was a genuine producer. He was bringing in around 165K cash in a month and getting paid roughly 15K in commission for it, right? He was happy, he was hungry, and he was performing. It's exactly the person you build the team around, right? The next month, the manager decided to scale, and here's what they actually did all at once. They brought in 5 new setters, right? They gave them no new leads. They changed the compensation plan in the same month, right, at the same time, and they did it all with no lead prioritization based on the performance of setters, which I'll walk through. So it was a quadruple threat. Every one of those is a mistake on its own, and they did all 4 in the same move in the same month. So what happened? The new setters, who were incompetent because they were brand new, got fed leads off the existing pile, i.e. the new leads. The producer doing 165K cash had his leads taken by people who couldn't convert them. His pipeline got robbed, his numbers collapsed, and he was projecting to make something like 4K the following month, right? The new setters made almost nothing as well because they weren't ready. The business made less money overall, and the one person who was actually printing got demolished by a sequencing decision from the setter manager, right? So now ask yourself the obvious question. What manager would ever choose to make the business less money and torch their best setter at the same time? None of them. Nobody wakes up and decides to do that. They do it because they don't understand the sequence of the decision, so they pull all the levers at once and they call it scaling, right? So this is the golden ramp sequence. Here's the order that actually works when you bring a setter on. If you follow it exactly, every step will exist for a reason, so you need to follow it exactly, and if you skip one, it causes the problems. So this is the golden ramp sequence. So here's the order that actually works when you bring a setter on. Follow it exactly because each step exists for a reason, and skipping one is what causes everything above, right? So first, dial in your current dial per lead target. Before you add anybody, get your existing team into the 3.5 to 4.5 dial per lead pocket. You don't bring new people into a broken ratio. Second is in week 1, the new setter that you hire will call old leads only, no new leads. This is the step that everyone skips because it feels nice to hand a fresh setter with shiny new leads. Don't do that. In their first week, they call the leads older than your dial per lead threshold, which naturally pushes the personal dial per lead up to 6, 7, 8, and 9 as they work older lists. So your new setters are only going to pick up the dials from the dial per lead KPI. That way your revenue producers are calling from new lead to 4.5 and your ramping setters are calling from 4.5 onwards, right? From there, 3, you quality control those calls qualitatively and find their skill constraint, right? Because they're on old leads, you can sit and listen and identify exactly what's holding the new setter back from making bookings, and then you can train it all without burning the fresh leads that are responsible for most of your actual revenue, right? You're training on effectively cheap inventory, not on the leads that drive the 80-20% of the 80-20 of your revenue and the income of your top setters that's keeping them happy, right? And then 4, the old leads make KPI easier to assess as well. So older leads generally have a lower pickup rate, right? So the ramping setter has to make more dials to get conversations, which means it's actually easier for them to hit their dial KPI while you watch whether they've got the discipline and work ethic to do it. Because effectively, if they've got a lower pickup rate because they're calling older leads and they can't hit your dial KPI, well, they're definitely not going to hit it when they're on new leads and their pickup rate's higher, unless they want to work beyond the hours. But effectively, you want to be able to see in that first week, qualitatively listening to them on older leads, you can hear it and go, okay, this prospect might be older, but they still lack the skill. Like if that came up with a new lead, it wouldn't be any different. They would get stomped as well. So it gives you a chance to train them inside the ramping week, which we'll walk through as well, in a cadence of coaching that actually allows people that you've identified in your hiring that have aptitude to actually perform on cheap inventory where they're not under pressure to perform in the first 3 days. Otherwise, they're effectively burning money. You shouldn't have a ramping that is like the most expensive sales university course because you're having to spend 30-40 grand on ads, on leads to get this setter into KPI. Effectively, they should just be calling past the dial per lead KPI, right? Then listening to them qualitatively on call, going, okay, he's getting better. Let's work on this. You go through the loop of training that I'll discuss. And then the next week, you can start allocating leads based on an exact equation that I'll give you, right? So in step 5, then and only then you ramp them into new leads. Once they're competent and you've seen the trainability, you start feeding them fresh leads using a simple equation, right? The whole logic is that you de-risk the new setter on cheap leads, learn everything you need to learn about their skill and their discipline, and you protect your revenue driving leads and setters the entire time, right? So what we want to do is allocate leads by staffing, not by bodies. So here's the principle that prevents the pipeline robbing problem entirely. You allocate leads based on staffing, and staffing means the dollars a setter produces, not the number of bodies in the seats, right? This is another problem that a lot of managers do, is they consider themselves having 5 closers or 8 setters, when not all setters are created equal, not all closers are created equal in the sense of their availability, which is the only true unit of measure, which is if your closers, if you have like, you know, you might have 5 closers, but half of them are part-time. If you can only take 60 bookings in a week, that's really what you have. Your closing team is how many bookings you can take. It's a slots available. And the setters, it's how many dials that your team does as a whole, right? So we always bring setters back, not to are they an individual setter, it's how many dials they do, right? This will make it glaringly obvious why you wouldn't keep someone on the team, ultimately having a body that requires all the training that doesn't do the work, right? So you can work out exactly how many leads a setter needs with simple math. Take their KPI dials per day and divide by your target dial per lead. So if a setter's daily KPI is around 150 dials and you want them sitting at a 3.5 dial per lead, you do 150 divided by 3.5 and it's roughly 43 leads per setter per day. Your existing producers need that same ratio of leads to the dials that they're actually doing. So the equation is number of dials per day divided by dial per lead KPI will equal the number of leads you give per setter per day. Even if you don't individually allocate leads, you still go, okay, we've got a new setter on, he's in KPI, 43 leads based on 150 dials, right? For the team. And then as they work, it'll figure itself out. They don't have to have individually bucketed leads where others can't get access to it, right? So like the example I said, 150 dials per day divided by 3.5 dial per lead equals 42.8 leads per day. So we round that to 43, right? So now you allocate quantitatively the exact amount of leads the new setter will handle effectively, knowing you're not handing revenue to someone who will waste it, right? And like I said, even if you don't individually carve up the leads, as long as you provide enough total lead volume to match the staffing, your high producers won't have their flow robbed by a ramping setter who wasn't going to turn those leads into cash anyway, right? Feeding leads to bodies instead of to producers is a lose-lose. Your best person makes less and the new person can't convert what they took. You want to feed the dollars, not the seats, right? Now to the churn myth. There's one last thing because it's the excuse that lets all of this hide. When setters churn, the default story managers tell themselves is, well, Setters always churn. They all want to become closers. It sounds true, so nobody questions it, but it's not categorically true, right? As I've had plenty of clients where their setters are genuinely happy doing what they're doing, making 15, 17, or 20K a month with no urge to leave or even become a closer in the account, right? So why do setters actually churn? A lot of the time, the team manufactured it, right? Picture that happy setter making good money on a clean dial per lead. Then the team scales the wrong way, adds setters, doesn't add leads, and dilutes the pile. Now that producer starts getting taken and split, his income drops, and that's when he starts looking elsewhere to another offer. He didn't leave because he secretly wanted to close. He left because a bad sequencing decision quietly cut his pay, especially with the example I'll go through on some of the bad compensation plans that just aren't reachable. You double, trouble, or quadruple thread it, and this is just the exact quantitative or cause and effect reason why your setter left your account, right? You get the sequence right and the chunk of your churn problem will disappear because the people who are performing stay performing and they stay getting paid, right? So that covers the operations domain end to end. You read the data, you sit in the pocket, and you sequence your scaling decisions correctly. Now let's go through domain 2, or the skill that actually moves conversion, right? So we've covered the operations half of the game. Now we cross into the other half, the actual skill of setting. And I want to be precise about what skill actually is, because almost everybody gets it wrong, right? At its nucleus, the skill of setting is the ability to read a prospect's level of awareness and meet them where they are. That's it. That's the thing that moves the number, especially on cold traffic. The difference between a team that can do this and a team that can't is 20 to 30% swing in conversion of your lead to booking in either direction on the same leads, right? So this is why your setters get away with it on warm traffic, right? They've been carried by the marketing effectually. When a setting team is genuinely doing well, they usually have a strong organic foundation feeding the top of funnel, i.e. good content, a known founder with real authority, and they're running webinar ads and warm traffic that pushes existing followers or an already somewhat aware prospect into a webinar. That webinar does the heavy lifting. It raises the prospect's awareness massively and speeds up the sales cycle. So by the time the setter gets on the phone, the prospect is already most of the way there. The setter executes a script, and even a mediocre one does okay, right? But okay is hiding a cost. A mediocre setter doing okay on warm traffic is ultimately opportunity cost. It's money you burnt that a great setter would have turned into excellent results. You just can't see it because the floor is so high that nobody falls through it, right? Then the team scales and they add a colder lead source underneath it, potentially, or the offer ages, an old lead or a straight cold paid opt-in, add to a VSL with no webinar, and the watch time on that VSL is low, so it's not raising anyone to product aware like the webinar did, right? Now your setters are calling prospects who are sitting at problem aware and treating them as if they're product aware because it's just what they're used to when they speak to their prospects, because it's the only register that they ever learned. And it falls apart at scale because they were never trained to identify what awareness level the prospect is actually in and meet them there. That's the moment a team discovers that their setters can't really set effectively. The marketing stopped doing it for them. That's why. These are the 3 wrong things setters do when it comes to resistance. When a setter hits resistance, and they will because a colder prospect pushes back, there are 3 things that they almost always do, and all 3 things are wrong. First, they zoom out and ask questions that pull away. They get a resistant answer, feel the tension, and retreat into a softer, vaguer question that loses the thread and loses the prospect. Second, they blindly move on and just hope. So they ask a question, get a poor or resistant answer, and they just plow forward to the next line in the script, hoping the unaddressed problem really doesn't matter. I mean, it always matters. The prospect quietly loses conviction in the setter's ability to actually help them navigate the decision, and then the frame is gone, right? And then third, they loop on the same question, or they write the prospect off, right? So if they've got some gusto, they relentlessly hammer the same question, or they decide the prospect is just unreasonably skeptical and they give up internally. Every one of those comes from the same place. The setter doesn't know what the resistance is telling them, so they react to it instead of reading it. This is the right move. You want to meet them where they are and read the resistance, right? So resistance is actually signal. If your setters are trained to read it, it tells you exactly where the prospect is and what to do next. So let's use a coaching example since it's the cleanest. Say the setter asks something like, what's got you looking at potentially getting some outside help from a coach? That question is probing for solution awareness, and how the prospect responds tells you where they are. So if they answer it well, something like, I want to coach because of X specific benefit, then they're edifying the benefits of the coach itself, which means they're already oriented towards the solution. And they almost certainly got there because they're problem aware underneath it, because nobody goes looking for a coach unless they have a problem. Good answer, you can move forward. If they give you resistance to that question, i.e. they say, I don't really know if I even need one, right? That's skepticism, hesitation, then it's telling you the prospect isn't ready to be answering solution level questions yet. They're not solution aware. You've gone too far, too fast, right? And here's where order of elimination comes in, which is the part that untrained setters can't do. When you get that resistance, there are two possible reasons, right? And a trained setter can tell them apart. First, they genuinely have skepticism about coaching. Maybe they think they're scammy. Or second, they're just not problem aware enough yet to want a solution at all or see the necessity for it, right? So if your setter had already built good problem awareness early in the call, gotten the prospect to lay out their actual constraints and or their pain, and then probed towards a solution and hit resistance, that tells you something specific. The person has a real problem, but is resistant to solutions, which usually means they've tried solutions before and got burned. So now they have concerns, right? That's a completely different conversation than someone who just isn't enough pain yet. It's the same resistance on the surface, but opposite meaning underneath. And you only know which one it is if you sequence the call so you can read by order of elimination, right? So resistance is signal, right? Then we have the triple diamond, which is why people resist solutions until they're in enough pain, right? The principle underneath it all is that the triple diamond pattern, it's really at the core of all this. People resist a solution effectively until they're in enough pain to want a new way, right? Because we oftentimes will need to be cured of our stubbornness through disappointment before we'll genuinely consider changing. So pain, or the gap between where someone is and where they want to be, is the motivation that makes a person open to a new way of doing things. Without enough of it, they'll just keep going the way they were always going. Almost nobody goes out and buys a new car until their current one actually breaks down and they're going to be late for work. The pain has to cross a threshold first. So if a setter runs a prospect straight to solution or logistical based questions before the pain or the gap is built, the prospect will typically have resistance unless, like I said, the webinar or marketing already did the work. And it's because they're not in enough pain yet to want what's being offered, right? And the worst version of this isn't even a setter executing it badly. It's when the manager has built the script so the questions land too early in the emotional pattern. It's literally in the script. Now it's systematically bad, baked into the process itself, right? The script is not even setting the setters up for success to meet the prospects where they are, right? And there's a flip side that matters too, because it's not always about pain. The good to great prospects run on gap and identity instead. So picture someone who says, I like flying business class, but honestly, it'd be better if I flew private. That person isn't in pain. They're building a gap between good and great, and there's often identity wrapped up in it, right? A trained setter has to recognize that's the lever for that person, raise that gap instead of trying to dig for a pain that isn't there. Either way, the job is the same. Understand where the prospect actually is and raise the pain or the gap until they're genuinely open before you make those bigger asks like, why are you looking at getting coaching, right? Because once they've got their problem laid out, they're more likely to give good answers to why they want coaching. Whereas if you haven't covered it, it's why you're going to get resistance. Because it's not just a matter of what's in the prospect's head, it's have they said it out loud, right? So that's awareness raising, and it's the whole skill. So there you can see the triple diamond. For someone to accept gain beliefs, right, which is the beliefs that they should say book the call because you guys are a valuable company, they need to have their limiting beliefs altered, but people won't question their beliefs until they're in enough pain, right? So this is why it all starts with either pain or, if you're in a more sophisticated market, identification of the constraint, an explicit in-principle agreement of that, so that when you start asking questions to edify why they might want a solution, you'll get good answers, right? Now, multiple scripts only work if they map to awareness. A lot of managers think the answer is more scripts. The only thing that makes multiple scripts valuable is that each one addresses the awareness level of the prospect coming through that specific funnel. So A cold paid traffic script has to be built to develop a lower awareness prospect, to raise their problem awareness and their pain before the setter starts making bigger asks, like logistical or funding questions, right? It has to give the setter permission to take time. If your different scripts don't actually do that, they're just different words for the same mistake. And here is the tell that your process itself is broken rather than your actual setters. What's your one hero or high-performing setter? The one who outperforms everyone. A lot of the time, the reason that they're crushing isn't that they're better than the industry standard. It's that they're quietly not running your process. He's taking control of the call and doing it his own way, meeting where they are, because he understands from the sensitivity of having the experience where to go off script. Fundamentally, all that is that going off script experienced. Oftentimes, if you get a closer to do setting as well, why, we question it at first principles, why is a closer better at setting? Because they're in a cooler job? No, it's because effectively they've probably spent a lot more time, whether they realize it or not, developing the awareness of a prospect in the sales call effectively so they can lower the action threshold because they need the person to buy in the end. With a setting call, the prospects are more resistant. Setters typically don't have the experience, so a closer will come in. If they're ever really good, it's because they're good at coming on and off the script, meeting the prospect where they are, and doing just enough, knowing when to do a system explainer, as opposed to what a lot of setters will do, which is just resort to soft pitching, as opposed to actually building the prospect's awareness from the foundation, right? So a manager looks at him and says to everyone else, hey, this guy can do it, why can't you? When the truth is, he's succeeding by ignoring the very thing that you're forcing the other people to follow, right? So if your best person only wins by abandoning your script is the problem, right? So this is the highest leverage skill in setting, and it's the one that almost never gets taught for one simple reason. Most setter managers can't do it themselves. You cannot teach a prospect's awareness level to a setter if you can't read it yourself, right? Which is why ramping, which we'll go through in a second, everything, it's all about awareness, right? So now we're going to walk through ramping, the pip, and when to cut, and this is the one that I see everyone pretty much get wrong, right? The status quo is that there is no process. So this is the section I'd protect above all others because this is where teams are actually won or lost, and it's where I see almost every manager, including ones running accounts of 1 mil a month, fall apart, right? It sits across both domains for a reason. You can't do this part without the operations half itself because you need clean data to know objectively whether someone is trending towards KPI or not. And two, you can't do it without the skill itself because you need to be able to hear what's actually deficient on a call and judge whether it's trainable, right? Ramping and performance management is where the data and the skill finally come together. And if you get it wrong, none of the rest of the system matters because you either rot people who should have been cut or you'll cut people who should have been ramped, right? So these are the two opposite mistakes and the one hole that they share. Managers get this wrong in two opposite directions and both come from the exact same reason. On one side, the manager marries themselves to the reps, so they let a setter sit under KPI for months with no real plan, telling themselves a story every week that'll turn around next week. Then, when they finally act, the PIP is a rushed 2-week ultimatum, i.e. perform or you're out, which is most either lazy managers or ones that just don't know, with no actual structure, no real chance to improve. So the PIP is far too short to actually work, and the firing comes far too late, after the person has already rotted on the account for like 3 months, right? On the other side, the manager plays the hiring lottery. So they cycle bodies in and out impulsively, firing way too fast, never giving anyone a real ramp, just spinning the wheel, hoping the next hire is a natural. Both of these are the same failure. There's no protocol. The manager is living in ambiguity and stories instead of in a deliberate, bounded action. So here's the principle that explains why that's so expensive. That businesses scale at the rate of good decisions executed well. So the rate, which is the speed, good decisions, which is the accuracy, and executed well, which is the fidelity of the execution. If you move too slow, you rot. If you move inaccurately, it's worse, right? So the way out is to go slow enough to be accurate, make the decision, commit to it, and know whether it worked on a bounded review horizon. So you're proactive about it. Ambiguity destroys all three at once because you never actually decide anything. So you never learn anything for the next one, right? So we're going to walk through first why cutting on time is the kind thing to do. It sounds ruthless to say, don't fire so late. like I'm telling you to be cold. It's the opposite. Firing on time and pipping on time is the kind thing to do for the setter as much it is for the business. So think about what actually happens on a well-run team. If you were a setter on one of mine and you are underperforming, you might go on 3 pips the whole time you're actually working on the account, right? Far more than you'd ever go on a soft company. But every one of them is real. Every one of them is a genuine workshop, and every one of them keeps you in it for the full stretch, 4 weeks as prescribed, long enough that you do not want to come back on a pip. And precisely because you don't want to come back, you stay sharp, you stay in KPI, and you keep your job and your income and making money, right? The cruel thing is just not pipping someone at all, right? It's letting a human being sit unskilled, failing for months, taking no money home, getting told no all day while you avoid the conversation. Right? As a business owner or as a manager, you have an obligation to build people into the right roles through real training and real discipline. And part of that obligation is being honest early about whether it's actually working. This isn't a place where people's potential goes to die. Treating it like one by letting underperformance drift is the actual unkindness, right? So what we're going to walk through now is the proper ramp protocol, 30 units, the Loom loop, and the 3-week trend. Here's how I actually ramp a setter from start to finish. Week 1, they're on old leads only, no new leads, as we discussed, exactly as I laid out early in this video in the scaling sequence. That's where you learn who they are without burning revenue leads. From there, you judge on units, not weeks, right? Like I said before, with how many closes you have is really a construct unless it's about their slot utilization. A week is a construct. It's meaningless on its own, because someone can have 1,000 conversations in a week or 1 conversation in a week. What you want is signal, and signal comes from volume of repetitions, right? So I use roughly 30 units of anything, 30 meaningful conversations before I'll read a pattern of someone, because below that, you're looking at the law of small numbers and you'll fool yourself with red herrings. But once you've got about 100 plus conversations, that's a true read on their skill, right? So the training loop itself is simple, and you run it 2 to 3 times a week. First, you review their calls and find the pattern. So what you want to do is pull 2 or 3 real examples and identify the actual constraint, not a vague be better, the specific skill deficiency holding them back from making bookings, right? 2, you record a Loom reviewing those calls live. Right? So this is the artifact, and it's the pre-training. You send it to them to watch before the training session. Then 3, you jump on a one-on-one and you train the deficiency. They show up already prepared because they watch the Loom, so you're not explaining the problem, you're just drilling the fix together. And then 4, you do it again on the next batch of calls, you just repeat, right? So if a setter is genuinely hungry, you'd expect to fix a given deficiency in about 2 loops of that, right? You just think about it, right? If you and I, if we're hungry to get better, and someone with a high level of skill, it gives us a clear as day 3 to 5 examples of a specific skill deficiency, you would be like, I would be jumping on that. We would handle it fast, right? And here's the rule that saved me from wasting months on people. If a setter doesn't get into KPI or clearly look like they're trending to get there within about 3 weeks, right, of 2 to 3 times a week training, they never will, right? So I've watched it at scale across enough accounts to say it plainly. Now, full ramp to a profitable setter KPI usually takes around 90 days, and there's a non-linear compounding effect. You'll often see a hockey stick around that 6th week, right? But the trend has to be there and visible by about week 3. So you're effectively demanding that the curve is heading up and to the right. If it's flat at 3 weeks, 6 weeks won't save it, right? And you need to pull the parachute early rather than burn the money and the bad consequence of a longer goodbye, right? So you can see the trainability curve here. You should start seeing a hockey stick around 2 to 3 weeks. If you don't see that, it's going to stay flat, right? That's my experience after generating, at least at the filming this video, over $60 million US online, most of the time with setting teams, right? Because the litmus is the trainability curve and being fair about what you've trained. So the real litmus test, the thing you're actually reading, is the trainability curve. Are they picking up what you're putting down, even if they're not there yet? A trainable setter goes something like 5, then 10, then 12 with a clear upward pull. A setter who's not going to make it goes 5, 10, 12, 10, 12, 15, 12, 10, 15, bouncing around, never climbing toward your minimum, right? So This is why we need to see where our KPI is. It's not an absolute. Where is our KPI bookings per day? And we need to start seeing a trend towards it. If you don't start seeing the trend and you've given the training, how else are they going to get better? I can tell you after 3 weeks, you're probably not going to see much change, right? So same starting point, completely different trajectory, and the trajectory is what you cut on, right? But you have to be fair, and this is the part that managers mostly skip. A setter can only be as good as what you've actually trained them on. Unless you explicitly hire them to arrive at a certain level, if you've only trained a third of their critical deficiencies, you can't be surprised the full booking rate hasn't moved yet, right? So here's what fair looks like in practice. Say you've trained them on handling the not interested objection, and now they handle not interested well, but the booking rate still hasn't gone up. The unfair move is to write them off. The fair move is to recognize you haven't trained the other things yet, so you add the next building blocks, maybe their middle of core energy, which is just a evergreen skill in the core that they need to generate the booking, right? But if all you've ever identified is stopped at all their not interesteds, and you train them on that skill and their bookings don't go up, well, there's more to just handling a not interested objection that takes to get a booking, right? So maybe their middle of core energy, maybe their back of core tie down so the booking actually locks in and shows up, right? You give them those specific pieces, then you judge, right? Once you've got everything that they need to get the booking rate up and they've got it, and you've given them a real 2 weeks on it and it's still not moving, now you have a clear confidence signal to let them go, not before. You can even make it tangible. Ask yourself, how many times does this person need to be told the rebuttal to not interested before there's a marked change in how they actually handle it? If you're genuinely giving them the skill and they've had it across 30, 40 conversations with no marked increase in performance, there's your answer. The more concrete you are about exactly what they needed and whether you actually gave it to them, the cleaner and more confident the firing decision will become. Now we're going to walk through the bounded PIP in practice. So let me make this concrete with a real bounded horizon, which is again anonymized. A setter was sitting on a convert to booking rate of about 13%, right? The minimum we wanted was 20%, on the way to a real target of 25 plus in KPI, right? So here's the bounded structure I'd set and did, right? This week is the first week of the PIP and it's a boot camp. Daily, you run the loop, you review, you train, you review, you train. Core reviews and one-on-ones with urgency. You log the daily actions in the checklist, every review, every one-on-one, every training written down. This matters because it shows you and history exactly what you did so that if it doesn't lift, you can answer honestly, did he fail to pick it up or did I fail to train him? There has to be an answer at the end, no ambiguity, right? The gate is the trend. If it's not lifting towards 20% by the end of the week, and especially if it goes flat or down by midweek, you start looking at your bench to replace immediately. If it's climbing, you give it the next week to consolidate, right? That's the other half of the answer. You keep a bench. People who didn't quite make it last time into your team or strong applicants that you can pull in fast is what you need. The bench is what lets you avoid both failure modes at once. You don't have to marry yourself to a non-performer out of fear of an empty seat. And you don't have to play the impulsive hiring lottery fresh either because you've already got vetted people ready to go, right? And one more standard to hold because it underpins all of it. It is not acceptable for someone to be chronically out of KPI. These people in this high-ticket industry get paid a lot of money for a high-stakes job. And the main reason teams stay stuck is managers who simply don't hold KPI. The rule of thumb is I use around 30 bookings of signal. A setter or closer could be a rock star in any given 30 bookings. So if they're out of KPI across a real volume like that, they go on a PIP, no matter how good last month was, right? So if you want a larger read before a final firing or maintaining call, look across 60 bookings, but the standard itself isn't negotiable. And the PIP has to actually buy. It should feel like enough of a workshop that they never want to go back to it, right? Because that's what keeps the whole team sharp. You're not trying to break the person, you're trying to get them out of it. And you support them through it the entire way. But you bring real urgency because urgency is leadership, right? You get on there and you say straight, I see an issue, here's the result. I'm not going to let you sit here not living up to what you're capable of because this isn't a place where people's potential goes to die. Then you work the plan together hard on a bounded clock or review horizon. You get this section right and you stop the single biggest leak in setting teams, the slow rot of people who should have been ramped properly or cut cleanly months ago either way. You start compounding a real team instead of cycling bodies through seats. And once you can actually ramp and hold a team in KPI, you've got a new responsibility, paying them in a way that keeps the good ones hungry and lets the rest self-select out, which is the next section. Now we're going to walk through the compensation that rewards hustle without breaking your unit economics. So you can ramp a team now, you can hold it in KPI. The next thing that will quietly cost you is how you pay them, because the wrong compensation plan loses your best people and it kills the exact behavior that you need most, no matter how well you've trained someone. The whole thing rests on one principle. You must reward for the thing that you actually want. You want hustle and exceptionalism, so the plan has to pay for hustle and exceptionalism. A good comp plan does two jobs at once. It makes the people who push harder, and it makes the people who won't self-select out, right? And it has to pencil in the P&L. It has to fit your unit economics, because a plan you end up having to renege on is worse than no plan at all, right? There are two ways that managers get this wrong in opposite directions, same as everything else, right? First is flat plans. So we're going to walk through why flat plans will bleed your A players. A straight, say for example, 4% on everything, or all cash with no escalation, it feels clean and fair, and it's a slow leak on your best people. Here's why, right? A flat plan does nothing to keep someone pushing into the second half of the month, the last third, or the final quarter. If every dollar pays the same as the first, there's no extra reason to grind out those last few units when they're tired. The month's already pretty much done and it's decent. Your A players, the ones capable of exceptionalism, have no mechanism rewarding them for it. So over time, the exceptionalism just stops showing up, and eventually so do they. You send the signal that going above and beyond earns nothing extra, and people believe you, right? And then we have unreachable plans. So why unreachable plans will kill the push too. The opposite failure is a plan that looks generous on paper and is functionally impossible, right? So you set the big numbers behind a gate that nobody can actually reach, right? So let's go for an example. Consider a plan that pays 4% until the setter hits 300K cash. And then it jumps to 8 or 10%, more than the industry would ever normally give. It sounds exciting, except no one in the history of the account has ever cracked 200K in a month. So the setter does the math, sees that the good money lives behind a wall that they're never getting over, and stops pushing entirely. The whole back end of the plan was for nothing because it was never real, right? Now, there's one honest caveat. Sometimes a setter genuinely can't get to a number because of leads. But that's almost never a true lead shorting. It's a diminishing returns problem. If they're already sitting at a $4 per lead, calling the same leads again won't give them an order of magnitude jump because of what we discussed with the pickup rate, right? The answer is that they farm the rest of their pipeline, the old leads, the no-shows, the cancellations, the reschedules, the didn't books, other funnels, low-ticket buyers, while the main source keeps an efficient lead volume underneath them at a $4 to $4.5 per lead on the main source, plus a farmed pipeline. The volume to hit a real achievable gate is there. So set the gates where the lead reality can actually deliver them, right? So now we're going to walk through the escalator that actually works. The plan that works is an escalator with achievable gates tied to cash collection. So every milestone the setter pushes through pays them more on the way up, right? So here's a real one, anonymized again. This is the structure on the setter that I mentioned earlier, the one doing big numbers before bad sequencing torched him. It was 4% base commission, 5% once they hit 70K cash, 6% once they hit 120K cash, 7%, and then 8%, so on and so on beyond that, right? Every one of those gates is genuinely reachable, which is the entire point. With the escalator plus bonuses, that setter collected around 165K cash in a month and took home roughly 15K in commission. That's a plan that rewards the push because the setter can feel the rate climbing as they grind through the back third of the month. And it's a plan that still pencils because the higher rates only trigger on the high cash that funds them. But what you want to do is reward exceptionalism and let the rest self-select out. So step back and you can see what the escalator is actually doing. It rewards exceptionalism, which is the principle, and at the same time, it lets the people who won't hustle quietly remove themselves. Because a flat effort setter on an escalator just never climbs a ladder and never makes the bigger money, and eventually decides that this isn't for them. You didn't have to manage them out, the plan did, right? So that's the whole frame for compensation. Tie reward to the behavior that you actually want. Keep the gates inside what your lead reality and your unit economics can actually deliver. Never build a plan you'll have to walk back or renege on. You do that, and the comp plan stops being an expense you're nervous about and becomes a piece of management that works for you while you sleep, right? Pulling the hustlers up and letting the passengers off, right? You've now got the incentive structure right. So the last piece is how you actually run the week. So all of this, the data discipline, the skill training, the ramping, the compensation actually gets executed instead of just really understood. That's your operating cadence, which is what we're going to walk through now. Everything up to this point is just knowledge. This is a part that decides whether any of it actually happens, because understanding the system and running the system are two completely different things, and most managers stall in the gap between them. A manager who knows all of this and runs an unstructured week will execute almost none of it. The data won't get read because there's no time blocked to read it. The calls won't get reviewed systematically because reviewing is a thing that always slides. The one-on-ones happen when they happen because they're booked. They happen indiscriminately a lot of the time with no set agenda. So the whole system stays theoretical, whereas the cadence is what turns it into a team that actually runs, right? So the first principle is that you want to batch by activity, not by account. This is most critical if you are like whatever they're calling it nowadays, a fractional sales manager, you have a sales agency, or you have multiple clients, but it's the exact same in a sense as important for an in-house manager or a founder-led sales team, right? So the core principle of the week is that you batch by activity, not by account, right? So you don't bounce between a team meeting for one account, then a review for another, and then a one-on-one for a third. So you don't go to team meeting to core review to one-on-one. You group the same kind of work together. Team meetings back-to-back, one-on-ones back-to-back, core reviews back-to-back, right? The reason is that the work has a zone, and reviewing especially has a zone. When you sit down to review calls, you need to get into it, build momentum, move with urgency through it, and laser focus on that task. If you do one review, then context switch to a meeting, and then come back to a review an hour later, you never get into the zone, and every review is slower and shallower than it should be. So here's roughly how I run my own day so you can see it, right? I try to give my best, freshest energy to the live human-facing work, the team meetings and the one-on-ones, because that's when the people are in front of me and my energy matters most, right? So that goes early in the day. Then I batch the offline work, right? The data, the projects, the core reviews, the ones that doesn't need people into its own block, because that work doesn't need anyone else around. Then the human-facing work for another time zone goes in its own window when those people are awake. So for example, if you're in Australia or Dubai and you have a US or Australian client, you're in UK, whatever it is, I'll give you an example, walk through it now, right? So the only thing that breaks pure activity batching is time zones. If you've got Aussie clients and US clients, say you have a US offer, an Australian offer, or you have a US based business, Australian based business, even if you have a team with a US based team and Australian in your global, which I've done in the past for the same offers, you physically can't run both team meetings in one block, because when one set is awake, the other is asleep. So you batch by activity within each time zone and accept the split across them. But the principle holds, same work grouped in a zone, right? And I'm going to show you a visual example of a calendar. Cool. So what you want to do is protect your offline time for the work that doesn't need humans. This is the distinction that makes the whole cadence work. There's a category of management work that doesn't require a single other person to be present. Reading your data, building your financial model, working on projects, and reviewing calls. That's your offline time, what I call it. And it should sit in the windows when your setters aren't needed live, when they're heads down dialing and nobody needs you in a meeting. So don't burn your live human-facing energy on solo desk work, and don't try to do your deep review work when you're supposed to be leading people. Put the human work where the humans are and put the offline work where they aren't, right? The single separation is what stops the most important management tasks, the reviews especially, from getting endlessly bumped, right? So what you need to do is put it in the calendar and log what you do. Knowing the cadence isn't enough, you need to schedule it. Core reviews, one-on-ones, team meetings, and offline data blocks all go into the calendar as real, recurring commitments the same way that the setters have a roster. and you log what you actually do, the same discipline from the ramping section, right? When you run a review or a one-on-one or a training, it goes in the checklist. This is what keeps you in deliberate action instead of stories, whereas most managers and owners live in enough ambiguity to tell themselves it'll work next week, and then it never does. But logging your daily actions will force truth, right? So here's exactly what I did. Here's whether the plan actually worked or whether I didn't actually execute it. You can't improve a week that you never actually recorded, right? So you can see an example here. If we zoom in, right? So we'll take it to 200. And this is an example of a week you can run, right? So on Monday in the morning, you can have your team meetings and one-on-one, and you can run that all across the week. Then midday, if for example, you're in Dubai, or you're in a time zone where your sales team go to sleep or stop before you, or even if you're in the same time zone and they finish their day, you can then allocate once they're offline, they're off work, or you don't need to be around them, hustling with them on team meetings, throttling them, making sure that they're actually working. Then you can get into your offline work like data, core reviews, right? And then if you have a team in another time zone, you work another account, then in the evening, you can have your meetings and one-on-ones again for when they wake up. Right? You just need to have this blocked, same work grouped in a zone. It's scheduled and not hoped for. So discipline is safety. Here's the part about people that most managers get backwards. They think discipline is the harsh option and looseness is the kind one, when it's the reverse. A team is happier and more settled when it's disciplined, not less. When a team is disciplined, they feel safe. They know the standard, they know the plan, they believe it's going to work, and that they're going to make money. And that certainty is what lets them perform, which is why you need to be a leader as a manager, right? Whereas when a team is loose and undisciplined, they don't feel free, they feel adrift. And an adrift setter is usually a setter who's already got one foot out the door, just moving the week before they quietly leave you, right? So the discipline is the care, and it has to come from you by example. You can't run a loose, uninspired week yourself and expect a hungry, disciplined team underneath you. It's all about congruence and alignment. You lead it, you show the hustle, and you're visibly building it in front of them. They'll see it and they'll reflect. This matters double on a remote team because you don't have a sales floor, right? In a real call center, if you look away from your screen, someone walks over and asks why. And because of this, people got a lot done because the structure and the discipline were physically there. So when I was 19, I worked in a call center for a brief period before I went to the military. And if I looked away from my computer for 30 seconds, the sales manager would walk over to the table and say, "Are you okay? Are you working?" And then I'd go back, and then I'd see the sales manager sitting with the sales director forecasting and doing stuff. So it's like you do not want to be the odd one out not working. Whereas with remote teams, the setters are all sitting in their bedroom and there's no quality control, right? So you need to be strict on that. But how can you do that if you're incongruent, right? It just will not work. In no cases do you see high performance with this misalignment, right? So remote high-ticket setting teams have none of that. The default state left alone is entropy, people drifting, logging in and out, and grazing in the CRM. Your cadence and your data are the floor that replaces the physical one. The master rule you give a setter on a dialer captures the whole spirit of it. Stay logged in and on ready or ready to work until lunch. Then you can forget I exist and sales even exist. Go and live your life. And then when you're logged back in, you're logged in and you're working, not half in or half out. It's on or off, right? That level of clarity is kindness because it tells people exactly what good looks like. Every decision you make sits downstream of the truth in your data. Your reviews keep their skills sharp. Your ramping keeps the team in KPI. Your compensation keeps the right people hungry, right? And money stays the ultimate metric the whole way through. The single question every block in your calendar is ultimately serving, is this making the setting team more money than it costs? That's the system end to end. The last thing left is what it actually costs you to keep it running the old way and what changes the day that you actually don't. The cost of getting this system wrong compounds every single month in money that you'll typically never even see. So I've poked my head into accounts that are doing over 700K a month, for example, and the founder is doing somewhere in the region of 30K in take-home profit because their cost to acquire a customer is enormous, and almost all of that is wasted sitting in the middle to top of funnel in a cost per book call that's far higher than it needs to be, right? So they need something like 3,000 leads to get a sale because the setters, if they don't get a pickup on the first dial, just move to someone else and never come back. The money was always there. It's just leaking out of the setter layer faster than they can pour into it. So here's the thing that should bother you the most. Almost every client result with a setting team you see, especially the ones people flex online, is an underwhelming reality of what could have actually happened. That 500K case study could have 100% been a million. The team that scaled to 7 figures left another 7 figures on the table because the setting system underneath it was never managed properly at its potential. Right? The number they're proud of is a fraction of the ceiling, and the gap between the two is exactly the stuff in this document that could have been used, right? So bring it back to where it started. You're one of two people. Either you're the founder trapped as the only competent setter, capped at the ceiling of your own calendar, or you're running a team that can't scale past 1, 2, 3 million a month cleanly because the foundation wobbles every time you add weight, right? Everything in here is what moves you out of those two states. The founder who installs this gets off the phones because they can finally ramp people to standard and trust the team to run without them because they have a system and process to ramp, as we discussed. Or the manager or the operator who installs this scales profit instead of just scaling activity because the margin stops leaking at the setter layer, right? Now, all bad setting teams are alike. There's an old line that all happy families are alike and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. In business, it's the exact opposite. Every struggling business is struggling the same way, and the great ones are great in their own special way. But for setting teams, it's even cleaner than that. Just remember this, all struggling setting teams are doing the exact same thing as every other struggling setting team, and they have no idea. All great setting teams are doing the same thing as every other great setting team, and they know exactly why, right? That's the whole game in one line. The bad teams think their account is unique. Typically businesses, especially you see, under 100K a month, or ones that have typically got really bad systems, additive measures, and a bunch of tribal knowledge and just really bad habits and a lot of inertia, will typically say that their account is so unique, it's so different, their principles won't work, right? It's because their foundation is terrible, right? And they think their account is unique, that their leads are uniquely bad, that their market is uniquely different or hard, when they're making the identical mistakes as every other bad team on earth, right? Everything in this document is that formula. These were never talent questions. They were system questions the entire time. You can't ramp setters without a ramping protocol. You can't hold KPI without quality controlling the data and the skill. And you can't scale profitably whilst you're sequencing decisions in the wrong order and leaking margin every single month, right? If you fix the system, the talent problem mostly dissolves because the same people start producing the moment that the structure around them is actually right. And money stays the ultimate metric the whole way through. So just remember, every decision you make sits downstream of the truth in your data, and the only question that ever matters is whether a decision makes the setting team more than it costs. So what do we do with this? Most people who read this will understand it completely and still not execute, because knowing isn't doing. The system is only worth what you actually install in your data, your reviews, your ramping, your compensation, and in your week. So if you take nothing else, take the fastest win and go do it this week. Read your dial per lead correctly. Sit your team in a 3.5 to 4.5 dial per lead pocket. Hold the rule of 100, and that alone usually effectively decreases your cost per book call, and it'll prove the rest of this to you in your own numbers. And if you'd rather have this system installed properly by me so you can ramp setters who actually hold KPI, get yourself off the phones for good, and scale the team profitably without learning every piece of this the hard way, you can see how that we do that here.